The air in the mess tent at Forward Operating Base Nightingale was a thick, unappetizing stew. It was composed of equal parts aerosolized dust from the Kandahar Basin, the acrid tang of diesel exhaust from the generators that powered their small island of civilization, and the faint, lingering ghost of 10,000 meals of powdered eggs and overboiled coffee. It was an atmosphere you didn't so much breathe as chew. The constant, low-frequency hum of the base's life support systems vibrated through the cheap plastic chairs and the dented metal tables, a monotonous drone that was the soundtrack to a war fought in slow motion. A war of waiting punctuated by moments of sheer, unadulterated terror. The fluorescent lights overhead cast everything in a sterile, greenish-white pallor, making the living look vaguely like the dead. It was a place stripped of all comfort, all pretense, designed for function and survival, and nothing more. In a corner, away from the boisterous cluster of infantrymen who treated the mess tent as their personal fiefdom, sat Sergeant Eva Rostova. To call her unassuming would be to engage in a profound understatement. She was small of frame, with a face that seemed designed for forgetting, plain and unadorned, framed by brown hair pulled back into a severe regulation bun. Her uniform, a standard operational camouflage pattern, was clean but faded from countless washings in harsh, mineral-heavy water. It hung on her slightly, suggesting she was more accustomed to a different cut, or perhaps a different world entirely. She nursed a mug of the aforementioned coffee, holding it in both hands as if to absorb its meager warmth, though the ambient temperature was already stifling. Her posture was one of perfect economic stillness. She was not reading, not looking at a phone, not engaging with anyone. She was simply observing, her gaze distant but focused, her presence so quiet it was almost a physical absence. She was a ghost at the feast, a footnote in a chapter dominated by larger, louder men. Major Kalen Thorne was neither quiet nor a footnote. He was the chapter's title, printed in bold, capital letters. He strode into the mess tent as if he were planting a flag on conquered territory, his boots striking the plywood floor with deliberate, concussive force. He was a big man, built like a battering ram, with a thick neck and a jaw that looked like it had been quarried from granite. His face, weathered by sun and scoured by wind, was a monument to the infantry's self-regard. He radiated an aura of unearned confidence, the kind that comes from believing the world is a simple problem that can be solved with sufficient application of aggression. He was the commander of the rifle company responsible for the FOB's perimeter security, and in this small, dusty kingdom, he was a prince. His men, a collection of younger, louder versions of himself, immediately made space for him at their table, their banter quieting to a respectful murmur as he sat. Authority, for men like Thorne, was not a responsibility to be carried, but a space to be occupied, loudly and without question. Thorne's eyes swept the room, a landlord surveying his property. He took in the familiar faces, the tired medics, the perpetually stressed logistics officers, and then his gaze landed on the still figure in the corner. It snagged, held. He saw a small woman, wearing sergeant's stripes he hadn't noticed before, sitting alone. She was an anomaly. In his rigidly defined world, people existed in groups, in fire teams, in squads. Loners were suspect. Women in a combat zone, to his mind, were an even greater anomaly, usually confined to roles he considered secondary: administration, communication, supply. He saw her quietness not as discipline, but as weakness. He saw her solitude not as introspection, but as fear. He saw a nail that was not hammered down, and his entire being was a hammer. He rose from his table, a smirk playing on his lips. This was sport, a way to break the monotony. He sauntered over, his shadow falling over her table long before he arrived. The chatter in the room faded as his men, and then others, sensed the beginning of a familiar ritual. Major Thorne was about to teach someone a lesson. "Well, well, what do we have here?" His voice was a theatrical baritone, designed to carry. "Lost, Sergeant?" Sergeant Rostova did not startle. She did not look up immediately. She finished a slow, deliberate sip of her coffee, then placed the mug down on the table with a soft, precise click. Only then did she raise her eyes to meet his. Her expression was utterly neutral, a placid lake he was about to throw a boulder into. "Major." It was not a question. It was a simple statement of fact, an acknowledgement of his rank and nothing more. The lack of deference, the absence of the slight flinch of intimidation he expected, was irritating. It was like pushing on a door that was already open. "I don't recognize you," he continued, leaning forward, placing his big hands on her small table. The plastic creaked in protest. "You with the loggies? Or maybe the comms shack? Must be nice sitting in the air conditioning while the real soldiers are out walking the wire." His words were laced with the casual contempt the infantry often held for support personnel, the so-called POGs, persons other than grunts. "I'm attached to the J2 section, Major." Her voice was low, even, betraying no emotion. J2, intelligence. To Thorne, that was even worse. Clerks and analysts playing with maps and reports, completely detached from the grit and blood of the real war. "J2, he scoffed, straightening up and turning to play to his audience, who were now openly watching, grinning. "So you're one of the brains of the operation, pushing paper around, telling us where the bad guys were yesterday." He turned back to her, his smile widening. "Tell me, Sergeant, you ever even held a rifle that wasn't for a qualification range once a year?" Her response was silence. She simply watched him, her eyes unblinking. It was not the fearful silence of a subordinate caught in a superior's glare. It was the patient silence of a geologist watching a volcano rumble, knowing the eruption is inevitable but ultimately insignificant in the grand scheme of things. It was a profound, unnerving calm that seemed to absorb the energy of his aggression and nullify it. She was a lioness, allowing a jackal to dance at the edge of its kill radius, utterly unimpressed. This infuriated Thorne more than any argument could have. He was used to reactions. He thrived on them. Fear, anger, stammering justifications. These were the currencies of his dominance. Her placid stillness was a denial of his power, an insult of the highest order. He felt his face flush. He needed to escalate, to force a crack in that serene facade. He leaned in close, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial growl that was still loud enough for the nearest tables to hear. "You know, Sergeant, this is a dangerous place. It's no place for someone like you. You should probably stay inside the wire, where it's safe. Leave the serious business to the men." He punctuated the statement by shoving her table. It was not a violent push, but it was deliberate and demeaning. The table scraped backwards a few inches. The coffee in her mug sloshed, a dark brown wave cresting over the rim and spilling onto the dusty floor. She did not flinch. She did not turn. Her gaze remained locked on his. She watched him for a long, silent moment. Then, with an economy of motion that was almost hypnotic, she reached down, took hold of the table, and slid it back to its original position. A small, precise correction. She then used a napkin to carefully wipe the single drop of coffee that had landed on her boot. Having restored her small corner of the world to its proper order, she looked back up at him. "Is there anything else, Major?" she asked, her tone suggesting he was a waiter who had brought the wrong order. The collective breath of the onlookers was held. Thorne's face went from red to a deep, mottled purple. He was a bull who had charged a statue. He had used his size, his rank, his voice, his physicality, and had achieved nothing. He had been dismissed, publicly, quietly, completely. He opened his mouth to unleash a torrent of fury, to truly crush this infuriatingly calm woman under the weight of his rank and rage. He never got the chance. The world outside the tent dissolved into a cataclysm of sound and pressure. The first mortar round landed just outside the perimeter wire. A deafening crump that was felt as much as heard, a violent punch to the chest that rattled the entire structure. The lights flickered, died, then came back on, humming with a new, frantic energy. Before the last syllable of the explosion had faded, the high, terrifying shriek of the incoming alert siren began its cyclical wail. Incoming, incoming, incoming. Chaos erupted. The practiced, half-bored calm of the FOB evaporated in an instant. Men who had been laughing seconds before were now scrambling, overturning chairs, their faces masks of adrenaline-fueled urgency. They were soldiers, trained for this. But the first moments of a complex attack were always a maelstrom of confusion. Thorne, his personal humiliation instantly forgotten, snapped into command mode. "To the line! All personnel to battle stations! Second platoon, get suppressive fire on Sector 3! Mortar pit! Counter battery! Now!" His voice was a roar, a tool of command that cut through the initial panic. He was in his element now. This was what he understood. Violence, action, reaction. He was already moving toward the exit, his men falling in around him, a weapon of instinct pointed at the enemy. But his authority, so absolute a moment ago, was already failing. His orders were standard, by the book, a reflexive response to a generic threat. He was shouting to put out a fire without knowing where it was coming from or what was fueling it. A second mortar landed, closer this time, and the distinctive high-velocity crack of a heavy sniper rifle echoed from the ridgeline to the east. A spray of dust and gravel peppered the side of the mess tent. The rounds were not random. They were targeted, precise. Inside the Tactical Operations Center, a cramped container packed with radios and monitors, the scene was one of controlled panic. A young lieutenant was shouting into a handset, trying to get a clear report from the observation posts, his voice cracking with stress. The enemy was using the mortar fire to cover the movement of their sniper, a classic and brutally effective tactic. The sniper, in turn, was pinning down the crew of the heavy machine gun nest that was supposed to be providing the most effective suppressive fire. It was a coordinated, intelligent attack, and Thorne's blunt force response was a fatal miscalculation. It was into this vortex of noise and fear that Sergeant Eva Rostova moved. The moment the first round hit, her stillness had shattered, but not into panic. It had transformed into a state of pure, terrifying purpose. She rose from her chair, not with a soldier's scramble, but with the fluid grace of a predator. Her movements were devoid of wasted energy. While others ran, she flowed through the chaos, her eyes scanning, processing, analyzing. She was not heading for a bunker. She was heading for the Tausi. She entered the command center without a word. The lieutenant barely registered her presence. Rostova's eyes went straight to the main tactical display, a satellite map of the area with blinking icons representing friendly and enemy positions. She absorbed the data in a single, sweeping glance. Her mind, a finely tuned instrument of war, processed the vectors of the incoming fire, the locations of the impacts, the reported position of the sniper. It took her less than 3 seconds to understand the intricate geometry of the attack. She stepped up to a secondary communications console, her fingers flying over the keypad with practiced dexterity. "This is call sign Observer Actual to all stations," she said, her voice cutting through the radio static with an authority that was absolute. It was the same low, even tone she had used with Thorn, but now it was imbued with an unmistakable weight of command. "Cease counter-battery fire. The mortars are a diversion. I need the LRAS-3 on grid 345-9-821. Focus on the rock formation. I need thermal overlay now." The radio operator, a kid barely out of his teens, stared at her, bewildered. Who was this sergeant, giving orders that countermanded a major's? Rostova didn't look at him. Her eyes were fixed on the screen. "Do it," she said, the 2 words landing with the force of a physical blow. The operator, compelled by a certainty he couldn't explain, complied. An image flickered onto a side monitor, a grainy black and white view from a long-range reconnaissance asset. It zoomed in on the designated grid square. At first, it was just a jumble of hot rocks. Then, Rostova pointed a single, steady finger at the screen. "There. Thermal bloom, 2-man team. 1 shooter, 1 spotter. They're dug in deep." The lieutenant stared, his mouth agape. On the screen, 2 faint, man-shaped heat signatures were now visible, almost perfectly camouflaged. They had been invisible to everyone else. Just then, the door to the TOC burst open, and General Marcus Vance stormed in. Vance was the theater commander, on the FOB for a surprise inspection. He was a living legend, a man whose face looked like it had been carved from military tradition itself. His presence instantly silenced the room. He was followed by a panicked-looking Major Thorn, who had realized the situation on the line was untenable and had come back for better intelligence. "Report!" Vance's voice was like rocks grinding together. The lieutenant stammered, but before he could form a coherent sentence, Rostova spoke, her back still to the room. "Sir, we have a high-threat sniper team at grid 345-9-821. They have our M2 gunner pinned. They are the primary threat. The mortars are harassing fire, designed to draw our attention and keep our heads down. They're preventing medevac for 2 wounded men in the open." Vance's sharp eyes took in the scene. The data on the screen, the calm, authoritative woman in the sergeant's uniform, and the floundering major behind him. He didn't waste time on questions of protocol. He saw competence, and he latched onto it. "What's the solution, Sergeant?" "We need a heavy-caliber weapon on the roof of this TOC," she replied without turning. "It's the only position with a clear line of sight that isn't currently suppressed. We need to neutralize that sniper. Now." "My men can't get to the armory, they're pinned!" Thorn blurted out, stating the obvious. "The emergency locker is right here," Rostova said, finally turning. She pointed to a heavy steel cabinet in the corner of the TOC. "It contains 1 M107 Barrett, 50 caliber, more than enough range and power." Vance was already moving. "Good thinking, Sergeant. Let's get it topside." He wrenched open the locker and hefted the massive anti-materiel rifle. The M107 was a beast of a weapon, nearly 5 feet long and weighing over 30 pounds. It was not a one-person job to move and set up quickly under fire. "You!" Vance barked, looking for the nearest available body to help him. His eyes fell on Rostova. In the heat of the moment, she was just a pair of hands, a soldier to be commanded. He saw her stripes, her small stature, and made the most natural assumption in the world. She was a porter, a helper. "Sergeant, give me a hand with this. Let's move," he commanded, thrusting the heavy rifle towards her. He intended to carry the bulk of it himself, with her just steadying the barrel as they navigated the narrow ladder to the roof. This was the moment where the universe pivoted. This was the fulcrum on which the entire narrative of the day and of Kalen Thorne's life would turn. Rostova stepped forward and took the rifle from the general. She did not take one end of it. She took all of it. She cradled the 30-pound weapon in her arms as if it were a child, her movements fluid and sure, her body mechanics perfectly balanced to handle the weight. The rifle, which looked oversized and cumbersome in the general's hands, seemed to settle into hers as if it had been forged for her. As she turned to head for the ladder, the movement caused the collar of her tactical vest to shift slightly. It was a tiny, almost imperceptible change. But General Vance's eyes, trained over 30 years of service to notice the smallest details, caught it. There, pinned discreetly to the uniform beneath her vest, was a small, understated badge. It was not a common marksmanship badge. It was a simple, blackened metal rectangle with a stylized scope reticle and the letters SOTIC engraved upon it. Special Operations Target Interdiction Course. The blood drained from General Vance's face. His breath caught in his throat. It was as if he had casually asked a janitor for a light and had been answered by the Archangel Michael. The SOTIC badge was not just a qualification, it was a legend. It was the PhD of killing, awarded to only a handful of operators in the entire United States military. It signified a master of ballistics, a ghost who could navigate the complex mathematics of wind, gravity, and Coriolis effect in their sleep, and deliver a single, perfect shot from over a mile away. It was a symbol of a skill set so rare, so lethal, it was considered a strategic national asset. He understood his mistake. It was a mistake of cosmic proportions. He had not just handed a rifle to a random sergeant. He had handed a paintbrush to Rembrandt. He had handed a scalpel to the world's greatest surgeon. He had handed a thunderbolt to Zeus. Major Thorne, standing just behind him, saw the change in the general's expression. He saw the general's eyes lock onto the small pin on the sergeant's uniform. He didn't recognize the badge himself, but he recognized the look on Vance's face. It was a look of pure, unadulterated awe, mixed with a healthy dose of what looked like fear. Vance took a half-step back, an involuntary retreat from the sheer density of competence that had just been revealed. His entire demeanor shifted from that of a commander to that of a subordinate. He raised a hand to his radio. "All stations, this is Olympus," he said, his voice now a low, reverent hush, using his own call sign to signal the importance of the message. "Stand down. I say again, stand down. Wraith has the target." The name descended into the silent talk like a physical object. Wraith. Thorne felt a cold dread snake its way up his spine. He didn't know who Wraith was, not exactly, but he knew the name. It was a whisper in the intelligence briefings, a ghost story the Special Forces guys told over beers. Wraith was a hyper-lethal asset, a solo operator attached to Joint Special Operations Command, a phantom credited with dozens of high-value target eliminations in theaters of war that were officially peaceful. Wraith's file was a black hole of redactions. Wraith's existence was officially denied. Wraith was not supposed to be a small, quiet woman in a logistics sergeant's uniform. The woman, the legend, was already moving. Rostova, or Wraith, ascended the ladder to the roof with the heavy rifle cradled in one arm, her movements impossibly smooth. She emerged into the chaos of the open air, the crack of incoming rounds and the crump of distant mortars filling the sky. She paid them no mind. They were simply environmental data. She laid the rifle on its bipod at the edge of the roof, the long barrel pointing towards the eastern ridgeline. Her hands moved with a surgeon's precision, a blur of practiced motion. She attached the scope, her fingers dialing in adjustments with tiny, perfect clicks. She pulled a Kestrel wind meter from her pocket, held it up for a few seconds, then put it away. She lay down behind the weapon, settling into the prone position, becoming a part of the rifle, an extension of the cold steel and glass. Her body became utterly still. Thorne and Vance had followed her up. They stayed well back, knowing they were now merely spectators at an event far beyond their own capabilities. Thorne watched, his mind a whirlwind of disbelief and dawning horror. This was the woman he had belittled. This was the clerk he had accused of never holding a rifle. He was watching her prepare to take a shot that was well over 1,000 meters, at a dug-in, concealed target, under fire, in gusting winds. It was a shot that most trained snipers would consider impossible. The narrator of this story would later explain that what he was witnessing was not just marksmanship. It was an art form. He was seeing a mind that could simultaneously calculate windage, spin drift, barometric pressure, and the subtle downward pull of the earth itself. He was watching a body that had achieved such a profound level of discipline that it could command its own heart to slow, to beat in the spaces between the beats, creating a moment of perfect stillness for the trigger press. Rostova's breathing slowed until it was almost imperceptible. She became one with the scope, her world shrinking to the small, circular image of the distant rocks. She made one final, microscopic adjustment to the elevation knob. She exhaled slowly, smoothly, until her lungs were almost empty, entering the natural respiratory pause. The world held its breath with her. There was a single titanic roar as the .50 caliber Browning machine gun round left the barrel, a concussion that seemed to warp the air itself. The rifle bucked back against her shoulder, a force that would have shattered the collarbone of a lesser shooter. But she absorbed it perfectly, her body a flawless recoil mitigation system. For a second, nothing happened. Then, on the distant ridgeline, a small puff of pinkish mist and rock dust erupted from the exact spot she had identified on the thermal imager. The high, sharp crack of the enemy sniper rifle was silenced, permanently. A cheer went up from the men on the perimeter, who had seen the result through their own optics. The linchpin of the enemy attack had been removed. The mortars, now exposed and without their overwatch, fell silent a few moments later, their crews presumably melting back into the landscape. The attack was over. Rostova pulled back from the rifle. She did not celebrate. She did not show any sign of satisfaction. She simply began the process of breaking down the weapon with the same calm, methodical precision she had used to set it up. Her work was done. In the quiet aftermath, back on the ground, the three of them stood in the shadow of the togs. The adrenaline was fading, leaving behind the metallic taste of fear and the smell of cordite. General Vance looked at Rostova, his expression one of profound, almost religious respect. "I apologize for my assumption, Sergeant," he said, his voice heavy with sincerity. It was an apology from a 4-star general to a non-commissioned officer, an event so rare it was almost unheard of. "I should have known." Rostova simply nodded, accepting the apology as a statement of fact. Then her gaze shifted to Major Thorne. Thorne was pale, his face a mask of shame. The foundations of his world had been pulverized. His simple, brutish hierarchy of strength and value had been exposed as a laughable fiction. He opened his mouth, the words of apology stumbling out, thick and clumsy. "Sergeant, I, I had no idea. What I said back there, I'm sorry." She held up a hand, cutting him off. Her eyes were not angry. They were not triumphant. They were clinical. The eyes of a diagnostician examining a patient. "Major Thorne," she began, her voice quiet but carrying the weight of an anvil. "Your apology is irrelevant. Your personal opinion of me is irrelevant. Let me be clear about what happened today, so that you might learn from it." She took a step closer, and the big, powerful infantry major instinctively took a step back. "Your behavior in the mess tent was not a personal insult. It was a critical, tactical failure. Your prejudice, your need to establish dominance based on outdated and flawed metrics like gender and perceived role, blinded you to a strategic asset operating within your own area of responsibility. You did not see a soldier. You saw a target for your ego. While you were doing that, a real enemy was preparing to kill your men. Your arrogance made you a liability. It created a vulnerability in this FOB's defense, and that vulnerability almost cost American lives today." She let the words hang in the air, each one a perfectly placed shot into the center mass of his pride. "I don't care that you insulted me," she concluded. "I care that you were, for a critical 10-minute period, a greater threat to your own men than the Taliban were. That is the only thing that matters." General Vance was about to step in, to deliver the career-ending reprimand that Thorne so richly deserved. But Rostova spoke again, her eyes still locked on the major. "Sir," she said to Vance, "I request that Major Thorne not be formally disciplined." Vance and Thorne both stared at her, stunned. "Instead," she continued, her voice devoid of malice, "I request he be temporarily reassigned. For the next 2 weeks, he will be attached to my J2 section, specifically to me. I have a long-range reconnaissance patrol I need to conduct. I require a spotter." The sentence was delivered. It was not a punishment of paperwork or a loss of rank. It was something far more profound. It was a re-education. For 2 weeks, Major Kalen Thorne, the proud prince of the infantry, would be the subordinate to the quiet woman he had mocked. He would carry her gear. He would watch her back. He would lie beside her in the dust for hours, watching her work, learning the hard lessons of humility and competence not from a lecture, but from forced, silent observation. He would be forced to see the world through her scope, and in doing so, he would be forced to see himself. And so, the legend was born. The story of what happened at FOB Nightingale passed into the lore of the Special Operations community. It was told in hushed tones at training schools, in ready rooms, and in dusty bars from Bragg to Hereford. It became a modern military fable, a teaching tool about the dangers of assumption. The details would shift with each telling. Sometimes it was a colonel, sometimes a SEAL team. But the core elements remained the same. The arrogant officer, the quiet professional, the crisis, and the humbling. The story was a reminder that in the deadly meritocracy of combat, the only thing that matters is what you can do, not what you look like. Years passed. Major Kalen Thorne eventually became Colonel Kalen Thorne. He was not the same man. The arrogance had been scoured out of him, replaced by a quiet, thoughtful brand of leadership. He was known for his uncanny ability to identify and nurture talent in the most unlikely of places. He became a legendary instructor at the Command and General Staff College, the institution responsible for shaping the next generation of military leaders. In his most famous lecture, the one that every student remembered for the rest of their careers. He would stand before a room full of bright, ambitious young majors and tell them a story. He would tell them about a dusty FOB, a loud-mouthed infantry officer full of unearned confidence, and a quiet sergeant from the intelligence section. He would tell the story against himself, sparing no embarrassing detail. He would describe his own foolishness, his own prejudice, with a raw, unflinching honesty. And he would always end the lecture with the same words, his voice low and steady. For 2 weeks, I was that woman's shadow. I watched her track an enemy cell across 50 miles of hostile terrain. I watched her speak 5 different local dialects. I watched her perform battlefield medicine that saved a child's life. And I watched her, from 2,000 meters, dismantle an enemy command structure with 3 rounds in the space of 10 seconds. She never raised her voice. She never boasted. She never had to. Her competence was a force of nature. He would pause, letting the weight of his experience settle over the room. Your biggest threat on the battlefield is not the enemy you can see. It is the assumptions you carry inside you. It is the belief that you know who is valuable and who is not based on the patch on their shoulder or the way they look. I am here to tell you that the most dangerous person in the room is almost never the loudest. They are the quiet one, the one who is watching, the one who is listening, the one you foolishly, fatally underestimate. Your job as leaders is not to make noise. It is to find the quiet ones, and then, for God's sake, listen to them. The moral of the story, then, is not simply about a humbling. It is about a fundamental truth that transcends the military and applies to every aspect of human endeavor. True strength does not need to announce itself. True authority is not taken, but given, earned through the quiet demonstration of undeniable skill. Substance will always, in the end, triumph over style. The world is full of people who talk a good game, who wear the costume of competence and wield the language of authority. But when the real crisis comes, when the mortars start to fall, all of that melts away. In that moment of truth, only one thing matters: the quiet professional, the hidden master, the one who lets their actions be their only argument. They are the ones who change the world, not with a shout, but with a single, perfect, well-placed shot.